A special thank you to each of our subscribers who make this channel possible. Here's today's story. In a significant move marking the 4th anniversary of the historic anti-government protests in Cuba, the United States government has announced sanctions against several high-ranking Cuban officials, including President Miguel Díaz-Canel. Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirmed the sanctions, which aim to hold accountable those responsible for the brutal repression of the Cuban people. This announcement comes as the Cuban regime faces increasing scrutiny over its handling of dissent in the ongoing economic crisis that has left many citizens struggling for basic necessities. The sanctions specifically target Díaz-Canel, Defense Minister Álvaro López Mira, and Interior Minister Lázaro Alberto Álvarez Casas, among others. The State Department will be restricting visas for these officials and their associates, citing their roles in the Cuban government's oppressive actions toward its citizens. Rubio expressed that the U.S. stands in solidarity with the Cuban people and their political prisoners, emphasizing the need for accountability for those who perpetrate violence against peaceful protesters. The backdrop for these sanctions is the brutal crackdown that occurred during the protests in July 2021, which were the largest demonstrations seen in Cuba since the 1959 revolution. The protests erupted in response to widespread dissatisfaction with the Cuban government's handling of the economy, exacerbated by shortages of food, water, and medical supplies. The police response was swift and violent, resulting in one death and numerous injuries among protesters. Thousands were arrested, with many still imprisoned and reportedly subjected to torture and abuse. Rubio highlighted the stark contrast between the suffering of the Cuban populace and the lavish spending by the regime on luxury developments, such as the Torre K Hotel in Havana. This 42-story high-rise, which has been promoted by the government as a symbol of modernization, has drawn criticism amid the dire economic conditions faced by ordinary Cubans. While the Cuban people suffer shortages of food, water, medicine, and electricity, the regime lavishes money on its insiders, Rubio stated, underscoring the disconnect between the government and the citizens it is meant to serve. In addition to the sanctions on individual officials, the State Department has also added the Torre K and 10 other regime-linked properties to its list of prohibited accommodations, aimed at preventing U.S. dollars from inadvertently funding the repression. This move reflects a broader strategy to undermine the financial resources available to the Cuban government, which has been accused of prioritizing luxury projects over essential services for its citizens. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez responded to the sanctions by characterizing them as part of a ruthless economic war, led by the U.S. He argued that while the U.S. government imposes sanctions and restrictions, it cannot break the resolve of the Cuban people or their leaders. Rodriguez's comments reflect the long-standing tensions between the U.S. and Cuba, particularly in the context of U.S. foreign policy shifts between different administrations. The U.S. stance on Cuba has fluctuated significantly in recent years. Under former President Joe Biden, Cuba was removed from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, which was a significant shift from the policies of the Trump administration that had reinstated Cuba on that list and resumed a maximum pressure campaign. However, the recent sanctions indicate a return to a more aggressive posture as the U.S. government seeks to respond to ongoing human rights abuses. As the anniversary of the July 2021 protests approaches, the U.S. government continues to call for the immediate release of political prisoners and for proof of life concerning dissidents like José Daniel Ferrer, who has faced severe repression. The situation in Cuba remains tense, with many observers closely monitoring the government's response to both internal dissent and external pressures from the U.S. and other nations. In conclusion, the latest sanctions against President Díaz-Canel and other Cuban officials mark a significant escalation in the U.S. government's efforts to address human rights violations in Cuba. As the Cuban people continue to endure hardships, the international community watches closely to see how these developments will unfold and what impact they may have on the future of the island nation. That's all for this story. We upload videos every day covering many different subjects, so hit that subscribe button to stay informed. Thanks for watching.